Yeah, she told me a lot about the difference between history, living history for
Yeah. What's that?
right, she told me about that. And there's like, so is it this Wednesday or like next Wednesday? I think it's like May 2nd that they're doing a site visit linked to it in like
Thank you. Let's come
the
together.
summer students actually will be yeah.
And 40 or 94% of them are on the other 50 states nationwide state insurance. And so I could tell my oh, you're right. Take her amount forward.
Thank you so much.
I hope they all get arrested. And that's why
So we've arrived at that moment. Are you ready for summing up? For final thoughts? For synthesis? Analysis? Thank you so much for all of your participation over the last day and a half. It's certainly been a lively exchange of views. I've learned a lot. I'm carrying away an awful lot of questions, probably more questions than answers, and I think that's really a goal of an event like this. I do want to remind you that we would benefit, that is Humanities Montana and all of its partners would benefit from evaluations. So before you leave, if you could fill out an evaluation, leave it with me or one of the other staff members with Humanities Montana. That'd be very much appreciated. And of course, I have to remind you that starting at 5 o'clock, we're going to have a reception, what we're calling the closing reception for this event, but also an opportunity to recognize 9 humanities heroes, including Betty Babcock. So there's a kind of nice overlap here of the Constitutional Conversations and the Humanities Heroes event. So listen, when we thought about who should lead the summing up session, really the answer was obvious. It was not a difficult question to answer. And why do I say that? Because Bob Brown and Pat Williams are great friends who have done this kind of work on many occasions in many places in Montana. And so we've got to bring them in. We've got to bring them in. Let me briefly introduce each, and I know you probably know them, but I just want to read their biographies because I think they're impressive. Bob Brown is a Navy veteran, history and government teacher, and longtime state legislator. Since retiring from the Mansfield Center at UM in 2010, Brown has taught at Flathead Valley Community College, serves on the boards of the Montana Food Bank Network and the Montana Historical Society. That's retirement. That's interesting. And writes a column for state newspapers. So that is Mr. Brown. And then Mr. Williams served Montana in the U.S. House of Representatives for 9 terms. He has taught at the University of Montana for 16 years and was recently appointed to the State Board of Regents. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Brown.
Bob if Ken remembered to say he was Secretary of State. And he didn't remember whether Ken had said that or not. Knowing that I have the same attention span, Bob said to me, did he mention that you were once a state legislator? And I didn't know that either. Bob and I were asked to sum up what has been said and how it affects the state, excuse me, and the federal Constitution. We heard more about the state Constitution, so Bob is going to be able to sum up that. I've had to actually dream up something to say because we didn't say much about the federal Constitution. What was said was grand, but not enough for this non-lawyer to be able to sum up in an intelligent language. So let me go somewhere else, but in keeping with the theme of these 2 grand days. And I want to relate some of what I found out in the U.S. Congress to little bit of what we've been talking about here. And I want to make 5 points in just a minute or so each. There's a congressional joke that when you first get there, as I did, you look around and there are people there like Bob Michael, the minority leader, and Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, Morris Udall, and other giants in at least congressional, if not American history. And you say to yourself, how in the hell did I ever get here? And then the joke is that after you're there for a couple of terms, you look around and say, how in the hell did the rest of them get here? And it's true. It has to do with the people, right, and their choices. I've always been a fan of the federal government, of all government really, but the federal government in particular. And I know that in this time of denigration of almost everything and anything federal, that sometimes becomes a difficult thing to admit. But I have great reverence for the institution of Congress of the United States, the federal Congress, and the federal government. And I think that without any one of them, this nation would be far, far, far poorer. I went to Congress wondering what is the necessity of the federal government compared to the state government, which I mentioned, I served in the state legislature. And I found it out rather quickly, both in Congress and my trips home to Montana every time I went near the Clark Fork River after being in Congress. I would remember my years at the University of Montana when the Clark Fork River was an open sewer. That's when the cities had it to themselves. Local government failed. And then the state had it and knew it couldn't afford it despite efforts to clean it up. And so, in effect, people petitioned their federal government. And today we swim and we fish in the Clark Fork River. And we no longer flush all of our sewage into it. In a great huge pipe that sometimes for the hell of it, a bunch of us from the university would go down and sit on the other side of the Clark Fork from that great big pipe and have a couple of beers and be disgusted at the sewer dumping stuff in the river. It was almost a shame game in those days. Without the federal government, we'd still have it, and without the federal government, we'd still have governors who stood in the schoolhouse door. And that's not a partisan issue. A great Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, nationalized the National Guard and said, no, he gets to come to the university even though he's black. And then Jack Kennedy, years later, nationalized the National Guard in Alabama and lifted the governor from out of the schoolhouse door. States left to their own devices would trample on people's rights, and it would take them far too long to worry about such things as our health. The proof's in the pudding. It took them too long. That's not to say that states can't do great things and be sometimes laboratories for change. They couldn't do it. We could not live the kind of lives we've led without a vigorous federal government. Time and time again, when I was in Congress, I heard complaints. And you probably think I always heard them about the Congress. But more often, I heard them about other matters. For example, people who do the transmission lines, people who run energy companies, railroads, trucking companies would ask me the same question I asked one of the panelists, and that is, do you think maybe there's too much government? Did you ever see the back of a truck? Tim has. You got license plates from around the world on the back of the truck, and they have to meet 50, 60, or 100 sets of regulations as they come through commerce. State to state, town to town, city to city, highway to highway. There's too much for them. It's too much for the energy people. It's too confusing. Now, is there an easy way around it? Well, if so, I don't know what it is. But while we're haranguing everything federal, we ought to remember there are government problems every bit and maybe bigger than those that we think are caused by only the federal government. The regulations and laws, state by state, make the federal regulations and laws look like a Saturday afternoon tea party. Americans have got to fix that. Most states, including our own beloved Montana, have far too often, in my opinion, been unable, or if able, unwilling to meet the basic needs of their citizens. Their pension needs, their retirement needs, state by state, they can't do it. Their health care needs, state by state, they can't do it. And we've only waited 200 plus years. They can't do it, or they would have. Is it that they don't care? No, it's that they financially can't do it. It's what the founders had in mind when they said we're going to have to pull together, we're going to have to pool some money if we're going to get on with taking care of all the now unseen needs of our people. And it isn't just pensions and health care. One state alone, some states alone have enormous trouble even feeding their people from within their own state boundaries, right? We can all see that. In Montana, we live in a kind of an orchard, so we think, we can feed ourselves easily, but many states can't do it. So we need help. We need regulation. We need reasonable laws. I teach at the University of Montana. It would take most of Montana's budget to simply provide Pell Grants, guaranteed student loans, and other scholarships for students in our colleges and universities. Would take most of our state's budget to do that. Wyoming can't afford to send all of its kids to school. No state can. None. Not even Alaska, with very few people and all of its oil money. So we need help. Now, having said that, I want to finish that part by quoting Jeff in the last the panel before last, I think. He said, Congress gives us this big pot of money, and then he pulled his hands back a little bit, and he said, but, well, that's what Congress ought to do. When it gives Montana or any other state a big pot of money, it ought to say, wait a minute, but this isn't your money. This money came from New York, and Chicago, came from Tucson there, and those people don't want